What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion was a series of violent attacks on courthouses and other government properties in Massachusetts that began in 1786 and led to a full-blown military confrontation in 1787. The rebels were mostly ex-Revolutionary War soldiers turned farmers who opposed state economic policies causing poverty and property foreclosures. The rebellion was named after Daniel Shays, a farmer and former soldier who fought at Bunker Hill and was one of several leaders of the insurrection. What sparked Shays' revolt? The farmers who fought in the Revolutionary War had received little compensation, and by the 1780s many were struggling to make ends meet. Businesses in Boston and elsewhere demanded immediate payment for goods that farmers had previously bought on credit and often paid off through barter. The farmers could not access gold or silver to pay off their debts because there was no circulating paper currency. At the same time, in order to guarantee that Governor James Bowdoin's business associates would receive a good return on their investments, Massachusetts residents were expected to pay taxes that were higher than they had ever paid to the British. With no means to move their crops and make money to pay off debts and taxes, Boston authorities began to arrest the farmers and foreclose on their farms. The rebellion begins. Farmers first attempted peaceful means to settle their issues. In the August of 1786, farmers in western Massachusetts began to take direct action against debtors' courts. For the Boston legislature to enact, committees of town leaders drafted a document of complaints and proposed reforms, some of which were deemed radical. But other actions began to take place. In Northampton, Captain Joseph Hines led several hundred men to block judges from entering the courthouse. They were joined by a contingent from Amherst and several hundred more men from elsewhere. In Worcester, judges were blocked from holding court by crowds of hundreds of armed men. When the militia was called in, those men refused to answer, and many joined the crowd around the courthouse. Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays, for whom the rebellion was eventually named, was a farmer in Pelham and an ex-soldier who fought at Bunker Hill and other significant Revolution battles. Shays became involved with the insurgents sometime in the summer of 1786 and had taken part in the Northampton action. He was offered a leadership position in August but refused. Soon, however, Shays was leading a sizable group and the Eastern elite claimed he was the leader of the entire rebellion and potential dictator. But Shays was only one leader in the rebellion. In September, Shays led a group of 600 men to shut down the court in Springfield. Determined to use peaceful means, he negotiated with General William Shepherd for the court to open while allowing protesters to parade. The court eventually closed down when it couldn't find any jurors to serve. A concerned Henry Knox, an artillery commander during the Revolutionary War and the future first U.S. Secretary of War, wrote to George Washington in 1786 to warn him about the rebels. Shays' rebellion escalates. The insurgents found support in unexpected places. Chief Justice William Whiting of the Berkshire County Court was a wealthy conservative who publicly spoke out in favor of the rebellion, accusing the wealthy state legislatures of making money off the impoverished farmers and claiming the farmers were obligated to disrupt government in response. Legendary patriot Samuel Adams, however, called for the execution of the rebellious farmers. The Massachusetts legislature offered leniency and flexibility to those with tax burdens. Amnesty was also offered to the rebels if they disavowed the efforts to close the courts. The farmers were expected to take oaths of allegiance to the state government. How Shays' rebellion changed America. Get the story behind the uprising that propelled the Constitutional Convention to form a stronger national government. Shays' Rebellion Monument. However, a bill was passed excusing sheriffs from responsibility if they killed any insurgents and declaring harsh punishments for rebels in custody. Soon after, the legislature suspended the writ of habeas corpus for a period of time. Another bill prescribed the death penalty for militiamen who took part in the protests. The situation continued to escalate. In December 1786, a militia assaulted a farmer and his family in Groton, arresting and crippling the farmer, which further fanned the flames of the insurrection. In January 1787, Governor Bowdoin hired his own army, privately funded by Boston businessmen. Some 4,400 men under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln were directed to put down the insurgency. Attack on Springfield Arsenal. Shays and other leaders made plans to raid the federal arsenal in Springfield to procure weapons. On the snow-covered morning of January 25, 1787, 1,200 men approached the arsenal. Some men had guns, while some carried clubs and pitchforks. At the arsenal, General Shepherd was anticipating the assault and was waiting. Shepherd believed the insurgents planned to overthrow the government. Meanwhile, General Lincoln's troops marched from Worcester to Springfield to provide additional defense. Two other groups of insurgents traveled to join Shays. Another rebellion leader, Luke Day, who had ridden to Quebec with Benedict Arnold in 1775, would head from the north with 400 men. Eli Parsons would lead 600 men from the Berkshires. As they approached the arsenal, shots were fired at Shays and his men. The first two were warning shots over their heads, but further shots left 2 rebels dead and 20 wounded. The rest retreated to Chicopee, sending a message back to Shepherd demanding the dead for burial. Lincoln sent troops up the Connecticut River to prevent advances from Day's group. Shays and his men fled to Petersham. Lincoln followed, causing them to scatter. Shays and his wife fled to Vermont. Aftermath of Shays' rebellion. Attempts to rekindle the rebellion from Vermont with Revolutionary War leader Ethan Allen failed. Allen quietly gave former rebels refuge in Vermont, but publicly disavowed them. The Boston legislature passed the Disqualification Act banning rebels from serving on juries, holding public office, voting or working as schoolmasters, innkeepers and liquor salesmen for 3 years. By the summer of 1787, the newly elected Governor John Hancock had pardoned many of the rebels. The new legislature placed a moratorium on debts and cut taxes, easing the economic burden the rebels were struggling to overcome. Some rebels were publicly paraded to the gallows before release. 2 were executed for burglary. Shays was pardoned the following year. He returned to Pelham briefly, then moved to Sparta, New York, where his legend made him a popular attraction for visitors. He died in 1825 and was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Shays is memorialized by the Daniel Shays Highway in western Massachusetts, a section of U.S. Route 202 built in 1935 that runs through Pelham. Significance of Shays' Rebellion. At the time of Shays' Rebellion, the newly formed United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, a document that many in the country felt was too weak to effectively manage the fledgling nation. The specter of Shays' Rebellion informed the debate over the framing of a new U.S. Constitution, providing fuel to Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists who advocated for a strong federal government and diminished states' rights. Nationalists used the rebellion to heighten paranoia, and George Washington was convinced enough by their arguments to come out of retirement and take part in the Constitutional Convention, where he was elected the first President of the United States. Shays' name was often mentioned in attacks by the Federalists against critics of the Constitution, who were referred to as Shaysites. When the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention began, many communities in Massachusetts that supported the rebellion sent delegates that had taken part in it. Of the 97 Shaysite towns sending delegates, only 7 voted in favor of the Constitution. Shays' Rebellion, a defining moment in early American history, was not merely a localized insurrection in western Massachusetts during 1786 to 1787. It was a thunderous cry from disillusioned Revolutionary War veterans and impoverished farmers, whose dreams of liberty and independence had turned into a nightmare of debt, taxation, and state indifference, and its lasting impact would ripple through the corridors of power, ultimately leading to the birth of a new constitution and a stronger federal government. Sparked by a combustible mix of economic depression, war debt, and governmental indifference to rural suffering, this rebellion found its roots in the failure of the Confederation-era government to provide for the very people who had sacrificed everything to defeat the British Empire. When the Revolutionary War ended, countless veterans returned home expecting gratitude and compensation, but instead they found themselves buried in debt, with their lands and livelihoods teetering on the brink of ruin. Many had been paid in nearly worthless continental currency, or not at all. Without hard currency, and with few viable markets for their crops, these men, once heroes of liberty, were hounded by creditors, threatened with foreclosure, and dragged into court by a political and economic system that favored wealthy Eastern merchants over struggling Western farmers. As the state of Massachusetts, under Governor James Bowdoin, levied crushing taxes, often higher than those levied by the British Crown before the Revolution, on a citizenry that lacked the specie, gold and silver, to pay them, tensions between rural and urban populations reached a boiling point. Boston's elites, whose wealth was built on credit and commerce, demanded payments in hard currency, which was nearly impossible to come by for farmers who bartered goods and lived far from ports or cities. At the same time, the government refused to issue paper currency or offer meaningful tax relief, further fueling rural resentment. Beginning in the summer of 1786, distressed farmers gathered in town meetings across Hampshire County and other rural areas to express their grievances. Initially, they sought peaceful redress. Committees of correspondence were formed, petitions were drafted, and delegates were sent to the General Court in Boston. But these overtures were dismissed by the coastal elites, who viewed the farmers' complaints as the petulant whining of the uneducated and unworthy. What followed next would be a coordinated and determined campaign to shut down debtor courts and prevent foreclosures through direct action. In August 1786, protesters began organizing mass gatherings to prevent judges from convening in the courtrooms. A crowd of hundreds, led by people like Captain Joseph Hines, surrounded the courthouse in Northampton, effectively stopping the proceedings. Similar events occurred in Worcester, where militia forces refused to suppress the protesters, instead sympathizing with them or even joining the cause. These were not anarchists or criminals. They were citizens, many of them war veterans, desperate to protect their homes, their families, and their dignity from a state that seemed intent on crushing them. Among them was Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain who had fought at Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and other major battles. A modest farmer from Pelham, Shays joined the movement reluctantly but soon emerged as one of its central leaders. Despite his opposition to violence and desire for negotiation, Shays was branded by the press and Boston elite as the symbolic leader of the rebellion, a traitor and would-be tyrant whose name would forever be attached to the crisis. By the fall of 1786, the rebellion had spread across western Massachusetts. Thousands of men, calling themselves regulators, coordinated efforts to shut down courts in Springfield, Great Barrington, Concord, and beyond. At the Springfield courthouse in September, Shays led 600 men in a peaceful protest that succeeded in halting the court's business. The order would be maintained by General William Shepherd, a fellow Revolutionary War veteran, but many of his militiamen felt for the farmers. Tensions continued to rise throughout the fall, with Boston's political class growing increasingly alarmed at what they saw as an existential threat to Republican government. Samuel Adams, once a champion of revolutionary fervor, now decried the farmers as lawless insurgents who deserved death. The legislature passed a riot act, offering amnesty to those who laid down arms and swore loyalty, but also authorizing the use of deadly force against protesters and suspending the writ of habeas corpus. They enacted laws that allowed the killing of suspected rebels without liability, and passed harsh new penalties, including death, for those involved in the rebellion. In December 1786, the situation intensified when a loyalist militia stormed a farmhouse in Groton and brutally assaulted a farmer and his family, leaving him crippled and arrested. Far from quelling the rebellion, this act of violence further radicalized the opposition. The farmers now planned something audacious: to seize the federal arsenal in Springfield, which was under the control of the Massachusetts government and housed thousands of weapons. On January 25, 1787, Daniel Shays, along with co-leaders Luke Day and Eli Parsons, coordinated a three-pronged assault on the arsenal. Shays would lead 1,200 men directly, while Day would approach from the north and Parsons from the west. But miscommunication and weather delayed the arrivals of Day and Parsons. When Shays and his force arrived at the arsenal, they were met by General Shepherd and a well-armed militia. Despite the rebels' determination and the fact that many of them were armed with nothing more than clubs and pitchforks, Shepherd ordered warning shots, followed by live rounds. 2 rebels were killed instantly, Over 20 were wounded, and the rest fled in disarray. Shays and his remaining force retreated north to Chicopee, where they regrouped, but their momentum was broken. The final blow came in early February when General Benjamin Lincoln, leading a private army funded by Boston merchants, surprised Shays and his men at Petersham. The rebels were caught off guard and scattered, many fleeing north into New Hampshire or Vermont. Some people, including Shays himself, managed to elude capture and sought safety in the far-off Green Mountains. Although the major fighting had ended, the political fallout was just beginning. Even though Allen was sympathetic, he refused to openly support the rebellion, so attempts to revive it through alliances with revolutionary icons like Ethan Allen were unsuccessful. Still, Vermont quietly harbored many of the rebels, refusing to extradite them. In Massachusetts, the legislature enacted the Disqualification Act, effectively revoking civil rights from known rebels for 3 years, barring them from voting, holding office, teaching, or even selling liquor. Yet public opinion began to shift as the harshness of the government's response became more widely known. When John Hancock became governor later that year, he took a more conciliatory approach, issuing widespread pardons and reducing taxes. Several rebels were paraded to the gallows in public shaming ceremonies, then released, though 2 men were executed for unrelated crimes. Daniel Shays, after spending time in hiding, was eventually pardoned in 1788 and settled in upstate New York, where he lived a quiet, obscure life until his death in 1825. Today, a highway bearing his name runs through Pelham, a silent testament to his reluctant role in American history. But the true legacy of Shays' rebellion lies not in the individual lives it touched, but in the profound impact it had on the nation's political evolution. The weak Articles of Confederation that governed the United States at the time rendered the federal government powerless to intervene in state-level conflicts, regulate commerce, or raise troops. The rebellion terrified the elites of the young republic, especially men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, who feared that such uprisings could topple the fledgling nation. Henry Knox had warned Washington that a mobocracy threatened the very survival of American liberty. Washington came out of retirement to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia after becoming alarmed by the events. There, delegates used the specter of Shays' rebellion to argue for a stronger central government. Federalists like Hamilton and Madison pointed to the uprising as proof that the Articles were insufficient and that only a new constitution could secure order, justice, and prosperity. The memory of armed farmers storming courthouses haunted the convention, galvanizing support for a national military, federal tax powers, and an executive branch capable of responding swiftly to crises. The rebellion also helped to sway public opinion during the ratification debates. Federalist pamphlets painted anti-federalists as Shaysites, radicals who would unleash chaos and tyranny in the absence of a strong federal government. In Massachusetts, which had been at the heart of the rebellion, the ratifying convention became a battleground for this debate. Ironically, many of the delegates sent to vote on the Constitution were former rebels or sympathizers, and of the 97 towns in Massachusetts that had supported the rebellion, only 7 voted in favor of the new Constitution. Nonetheless, the momentum could not be stopped. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. And the new United States of America emerged with a more centralized government designed in large part to prevent the kind of unrest seen during Shays' rebellion. In retrospect, the rebellion had revealed the limits of liberty when not coupled with justice and economic fairness. The painful lesson was that, regardless of how noble a political revolution may be, it must be accompanied by social equity or risk alienating the very people against whom it was fought. For all its chaos, Shays' rebellion was not an assault on democracy, but a cry for its completion. The farmers had not sought to overthrow the republic, but to remind it of its promises. They had fought for liberty against the British and now demanded fairness from their fellow Americans. In doing so, they forced the nation to confront the gulf between ideals and reality, and in that confrontation, they helped to forge a stronger, more resilient union. One that recognized, however imperfectly, that the health of a democracy depends on the dignity and inclusion of its poorest citizens. Shays' rebellion stands as a powerful reminder that history is shaped not only by presidents and generals but by ordinary people who dare to speak out when the systems meant to protect them fail. Though derided in their own time as rebels and radicals, the men and women of Shays' rebellion are today recognized as early champions of economic justice and constitutional reform, their sacrifices forever etched into the story of America's continuing struggle to balance liberty with order, power with fairness, and government with the governed.